we really have a problem with member states and governments not living up to the standard. Only 11.2% of these proposals are actually fulfilled after 1 year. That is simply not good enough.
It is really not just startups and SMEs that are drowning in red tape. It's also the bigger multinational companies.
Regulating is obviously not the way. Technology is always by definition the leader. The question here for me is more one of identity.
To start untangle this would be a process taking maybe 10, 15, 20 years. If it's urgent enough in our minds, we can do this. We can take decisions. If we want to invest and have innovation, we need to set it free.
Hello and welcome to the heart of the European Parliament here in Brussels. My name is Adrian Bartha. I'm the director of Epicenter, a network of 12 leading free market think tanks from all across Europe. And today we're diving into the details of the EU's regulatory simplification agenda. You have heard the buzzwords. It's all about economic competitiveness, simpler rules, and faster growth. It sounds all great, right? And these promises are indeed great, but a year into the current term of the Parliament, I think it is time to assess whether the positive rhetoric matches the legislative agenda. And to do exactly this, I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Regulatory Simplification, MEP Morten Løkkegaard, who is the Vice President of Renew Europe and a member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy. And also a very warm welcome to Adrian Nikolov, who is the Senior Economist of the Institute for Market Economics in Bulgaria. MEP Løkkegaard, at the recent EU Council meeting, there was a lot of discussion for an ambitious and horizontal simplification strategy, and they have mentioned that this needs to be done as urgently as possible by 2028. So we have all the rhetoric about urgency, speediness, economic simplification, but it seems like it's taking quite a while to implement all these ideas. What's your takes from a parliamentarian's perspective? How can this process be sped up?
Well, first of all, thank you for taking this up. I mean, this is for sure one of the most urgent questions at all in this legislature. I think that talking about 28, that doesn't sound very urgent to me. I mean, the very fact that they are pushing it to 28 in the council tells me that this is not urgent enough for some leaders, and that is of course troubling. For me, it's I mean, I'm a scholar of Mario Draghi in the sense that after his report, I think that it's obvious to every one of us, should be at least, that this is maybe the most urgent question we are facing right now, because we need the growth. And just to make it perfectly clear, we can't have this growth without a very speedy process now. And that speedy to me is now. It was actually yesterday. But let's take just one example, one figure. Out of Mario Draghi's 200, 300 proposals in his report, only 11.2% of these proposals are actually fulfilled or out of the table after 1 year. That is simply not good enough. And we can come back to, and I'm sure we will, in this discussion, why. We have a big responsibility in this house. I think that everyone, the Council, the Commission, and us in the Parliament have the same ambition. We all know the analysis. We agree on this. This is historical. I mean, if you look at the discussions the past 10, 15 years, that was not obvious that we all agreed on the analysis, but now we do. That's a good starting point, but now we really have to speed up and find out how.
So what are the barriers to speedy action, actually? What can be done as a parliamentarian here in this
it's not
building?
only about formalities, because we could do things very fast. Let's take an example, COVID-19. I mean, in 8-10 months, we actually provided 4, 5, 6 vaccines. If it's urgent enough in our minds, we can do this. We can take decisions. So coming back to my point, it seems like we're talking about it, but it's not urgent enough. So it's a mentality, it's a cultural question, basically, because we need in this house to understand that we need to make sacrifices ourselves in our legislation. And we are not there yet. And we can come back to examples of that.
And Adrian, we have talked so much about economic competitiveness in the Brussels bubble. And a lot of it comes down to barriers within the single market. And these sound pretty lofty words, but from a concrete perspective, from a national perspective, when we talk about barriers in the single market, what do they practically mean? Could you list a couple of them?
Where do we begin? Because the single market works for goods, and this is mostly the limit. But then we have to look in several fields at least. For me, the most important one would be the fragmentation of the capital market. Because this is probably the place where we differ the most from the other developed economy, the USA, which is a liberal one. And maybe even China, which also manages to raise money in a pretty efficient way. So moving towards a unified capital market, singular rules for companies would make the European economy run a lot smoother and actually manage to attract capital in a significantly better way, at least in my opinion. The other thing that bears mentioning is energy market fragmentation as well, because here we've seen some movement, but for me it's extremely slow. You have very significant issues with access, connections, and things like that, permits, which make cross-border trade in energy very difficult. Of course, the situation was worse 20 years ago, but still I think that we're in the same vein of moving in the right direction, but moving way too slow. Something which also bears mentioning is trading services, because I mentioned goods in the beginning of my answer. But trading services have been following very slowly compared to trading goods. And simplification here, licensing is a significant issue. Also some authorizations and things like that. And finally, I will also mention some very mundane things like waste management, product labeling, things like that, which are usually left to national parliaments, not so much to Brussels. But as a consequence, trade is very difficult in spite of the very good general rules that we have.
So many different policy areas, and I promise at least to energy we will come back, and occupational licensing we will come back. But you have mentioned the lack of the capital markets union. And so did you in a recent speech in Strasbourg. You called out the Commission that this has been an ongoing discussion for almost a decade now. Yeah. What is the main barrier from creating a truly unified capital markets union, and how can we overcome it?
You know what? I ask myself the same question for 10 years now, because every time everyone seems to be agreeing that this is the obvious choice. But why is it so? To some extent, I think that the national governments and representatives ask themselves the same question. But at least I can come up with one answer to that. If you look at, this is all about, making a more harmonized system. But that also implies a lot of giving up control over your own national financial system. You will have supervision, which is over-national, supranational. And by the end of the day, I realized no national government will give up the control when the day comes, because the financial sector is too important for national governments to leave for Brussels. So while they all talk about this, it all stops there. After 10, 15 years, we still have the same discussion about how does this supervision, this common supervision, looks like, and we are not getting any closer. So this is also a mentality. This is a question about culture, about trust in the Brussels system, and we don't have that trust yet. Financial services the financial sector seems to be too important to leave for Brussels.
But it's also too important to ignore. If you look at the scalability of European innovations, it's very different from their American counterparts.
Everyone agrees on that. I never heard a position to that. And that leaves me with another point here, which is important. If anything is going to change here, you need the top level to agree. We can all sit here and discuss. We can all in this parliament agree on this and this and that. But at the end of the day, this is an item, this is an issue for a summit between national and state leaders, and they will have to agree. So when that day comes, we can move.
Well, there is another area, though, where there seems to be an agreement, which is positive from a classical liberal perspective, which is the idea of the 28th regime. So that's also a criticism, that with the fragmented rules across the 27 member states, it has been extremely difficult to scale up young companies and startups the same way as in the US. So could you elaborate a little bit more what the 28th regime actually means and what the timeline looks like?
Yeah, well, the simple explanation is a fresh start. I mean, digging into this, it's more and more obvious for me that we have such a complicated system that to start untangle this would be a process taking maybe 10, 15, 20 years. That's the truth. So it's a temptation to say, let's start all over. Let's give especially the SMEs, a fresh start, a voluntary system so you can apply, and by doing that, scratch the whole thing. It's radical, yes. It's been discussed for years, yes. But now it seems, and that's the positive news, that the Commission itself, with von der Leyen in the lead, actually believes that this is the time to do it. I'm very, very much in favor, because if you notice that SMEs, they're maybe 95 to 97% of all companies in Europe. So this would be a revolution if we introduce the 28th regime. How it's going to be done, it's a very big question, because looking at these thousands and thousands of pieces of legislation, what to do if you start all over? That's really a good question, but I think let's try.
I like the ambition, and I think there is finally the momentum around it. But you have mentioned SMEs being kind of the foundations of the European economic system. But it is really not just startups and SMEs that are drowning in red tape. It's also the bigger multinational companies.
Yeah.
And a third of the EU workforce is actually employed by these multinational companies.
Yeah.
So when we talk about the EU's regulatory simplification agenda, often SMEs are highlighted and kind of the bigger corporates are almost left behind. But can you see why this discrepancy may create issues down the line if we have one specific set of rules for SMEs and other rules for big corporates? Would you actually endorse the regulatory simplification both for SMEs and bigger companies?
Well, don't misunderstand me. I think that simplification must apply to all companies, period. So this distinction between SMEs and the rest, the big ones, is maybe not the right way to look at it. It's often a discussion about SMEs because there are so many of them. I draw your attention to this myself just a minute ago, rightly so. But if we talk simplification as such, of course it has to apply to all companies, big and small. So this would be the starting point. But you have to realize, and when you talk about this, also some of the very recent legislation, it's much, I wouldn't say easier, but it's more convenient for the big companies to do this than the small ones, simply because they have the resources to do it. You have so many due diligence people, so many compliance people in the big companies that you wouldn't believe it. More than innovative people, basically. And that is of course, a tragedy. But nevertheless, they are the ones that actually can apply to this. So the existing system. So right now we have a discussion between some of the big ones actually wanting to keep some of the legislation because they already apply. So we spent thousands and maybe millions of euros on this. So why give it up? They say. We have advantages right now. I understand that point of view, but as decision makers, we can't, this luxury of looking apart for someone and taking care of others, we can't do that. So the starting point must be simplification must apply to all companies.
Absolutely. And when we talk about regulatory simplification, we cannot leave the discussion about state aid behind. And there seems to be a lot of growing appetite in some circles of the EU bubble to essentially increase subsidies to certain European companies to create European champions through taxpayers' money. There was an Epicenter research recently that highlighted that between 2005 and 2016, in the old member states, there was 61 billion euros of state aid, whereas in the new member states, there was only 6.4 billion euros. So there is a big discrepancy between the old member states and the new member states. So What do you think the intended and unintended consequences of this kind of industrial policy and state aid mentality would be, especially from an Eastern European perspective?
Well, first of all, these discrepancies, quite obviously explained by market size and the ability of governments to invest in the first place. Because older EU members are usually the significantly larger economies, both in terms of GDP and of any population, and they're much more capable of investing in their own businesses. And something that also probably needs to be added here is the desire of newer member states to play by the book, while older member states, especially France, Italy, Spain, those more interventionist governments would play more free ball, so to speak, with the regulations on state aid, and they usually have higher desire to intervene in their markets and create this type of giant companies. Especially France has a very long history of trying to follow technological trends and create state-sponsored giants in, say, computers. This is a good example, pharmaceuticals and things like that. They've been doing this for the past 60 or 70 years. Of course, the consequences are quite obvious. First of all, we can create a significant gap in growth because the countries in the single market which are more capable of investing in those sort of companies might spurn more economic growth compared to those in the eastern part, which are usually less capable of doing so, even though they've been playing catch-up more or less economically and growing significantly faster in the past 2 decades. The question here for me is more one of identity, because it's a very slippery slope to just follow the Chinese example of investing billions and billions of dollars in a state-owned company and hoping that it can catch up to the West, usually attracting the best of minds and things like that. But for me, this would not be the model. This has not worked in the EU, and it probably is not going to work. Of course, there might be some cases where this is possible, especially when we designate some strategic fields. Of course, here, the securitization of many issues is for me the issue, because we've been talking about creating a strategy for chips, for instance, or a strategy for AI, things which in the other parts of the developed world are traditionally left to the market. But here we have decided that it might be better to approach it through a statist way. And of course, we might just crowd out market players which might want to participate in these fields but would not be able to compete with companies which actually attract state aid. For me, this is again the question of identity, whether we want Europe to be a liberal, functional, free market, or we want to create these giant national champions which would crowd out other players. And finally, for me, something which also bears mentioning is blocking off investments from the outside, because there have been some considerations, at least blocking investments from authoritarian regimes. Here, China is probably the classical example, from investing in key industries such as biotech or artificial intelligence. And this might be the better approach, just wall off the European market in a way so that you can allow for local players to grow fast enough and stop authoritarian players from actually trying to obtain European tech and participate in our field in an attempt to disrupt it following other state motivations.
And can we have European champions without taxpayer subsidies? Should this be a policy goal of the European Union?
If you ask me in the old days, I would have come up with a very liberal answer to that one. But let's face it, times have changed, and we have this competition worldwide now, and we are dealing with big states, big rivals, which are openly supporting their own industries. So it's really not a question. This is something that we have to do. So we have to do both. I remember actually I had the privilege of having a one-to-one with Mario Draghi at some point when he visited this house, and I asked him the very same question. I said, "Mr. Draghi, I really want to know: Are we dependent on public support, state support, or the other thing, the private capital?" And he looked at me and said, "This is not a question. You have to do both, because we are looking at so big investments. It's so much money. So we really need to do both, and that is the task that we are looking into, and that is basically why we as liberals also in this house support to some degree state aid." And also, by the way, the Danish government, which my party is also a part of, have left the very liberal, starting point. Of course, in the best of all worlds, we didn't need state support at all. But let's just face it's always been the question when it comes to defense, for instance. I mean, when did we not have state support for defense industry. This is an illusion to think that we could do without that, because there are simply so many national interests in this. So of course, but what we said is we only need state support in strategic important areas.
Which are?
Yeah, we have to define them.
Right.
And that the case is that there are more and more of them by the day. We're looking at food, we're looking at chemicals, we're looking at batteries, we're looking at microchips. It's
we live in a complex world, essentially.
Yeah, everything is
when
linked.
When you put it this way, everything is security and everything is strategic. So what is not strategic in this?
I agree, and this is a confession, I must admit, because if you start looking at this, everything seems to be interlinked strategically.
Right.
But that's not completely true. We have a lot of areas which actually can live without state support. And for sure we have to define, let's say, between 5 and 10 areas where you need to go in and make a European stand on this and a European position on this and European common investment. We already defined them in some way. If you look at the legislative proposals that we are actually pushed to the table right now, we're looking at defense, of course. We're looking at, as I mentioned, microchips. We're looking at batteries. We're looking at rare minerals and earth. We are looking at maybe also on the pharmaceutical sector to some extent. And that's, I guess, it's about it. Some energy also when it comes to the building. Let's take an example, building up the grid. We have talked about this for 20, 30 years now. Nothing happened because so many wasted interests, so many national interests seem to be opposite. So what we need now is, of course, and this is very urgent, to build up a common grid in order for the energy to run through Europe smoothly. But we can't do this without common investment. Let's face it. So that's a very good example.
And it interlinks with the whole capital markets union discussion. So it is a complex process, but I understand.
Sorry for the complex answers.
Times have changed indeed.
Yeah.
I do want to return a little bit to the member states, though, because we have talked about occupational licensing being one of the barriers in a single market, essentially stopping the free movement of people if it's greatly expanded. And at the moment in the European Union, 22% of the workers are impacted by some sort of occupational licensing. So how do you see the role of national governments when it comes to getting rid of barriers within the single market? Is the conversation as urgent in the national capitals as it is here in Brussels?
Well, I can only speak from the perspective of the Bulgarian national dialogue, and I can say that we haven't heard the word occupational license for a very long time. So this is very much not a debate, at least in the eastern part of the European Union. There was an example of real estate brokers trying to create their own licensing some time ago, but thankfully we managed to block that attempt because this is obviously a field which does not require such qualifications, specifications. But back to your question, it's actually probably more than a fifth of the workers because this is only the people who actually work with the license, but when you talk about labor migration, this also affects the families of those workers. So it's probably a significantly larger part of the European labor force and the European families in general. But here we need to consider why we do occupational licensing in the first place. Because it's a the classic distinction between market efficiency, which would of course require no such thing, and ensuring the protection of consumers and safety of certain professions. Here probably the example of doctors and nurses is the classical one. But still, in the worst cases, when we apply occupational licensing, we arrive at a situation when we have siloed-off guilds of rent seekers, which just close off access to their profession to almost the entire other labor force. And of course, when you apply this to the EU, which is by definition an open market to work, this means that some workers are not as mobile as they are supposed to be, according to general EU rules. Of course, here again we have to consider this trade-off between safety and recognition of safety standards and labor mobility. And to me, leaving this to member states is probably not the best approach, because the EU is better suited, at least in my opinion, in designing regulation as to what would be the absolute minimum requirements for workers to be able to participate and practice their occupation in other member states.
So really identifying a small set of occupations, doctors, lawyers, etc., where occupational licensing is needed, But if you go to your hairdresser or nail salon, that's probably not as dangerous.
If we have to put it in
your doctor were
three
not
sentences,
licensed.
yes, we have to silo it off to safety, but then leave hairdressers and car fixers out of the picture.
But it's not just occupational licensing where member states do have a role to reform. It's all sorts of other barriers within the single market. But in the last decade, the Commission started significantly fewer enforcement procedures against the member states than before.
80% less, actually.
And it seems like this is coming from a political or under political pressure because of the larger member states being very critical of the Commission when it actually does. So what can parliamentarians and what can others do in order to ensure that the Commission does enforce the rules of the single market and really upholds the core four freedoms, even if some of the member states don't like that?
We can start by mentioning it, because they don't like it. We do that every time we get the chance to do it, because we think, I personally think it's a disaster. It's part of the overall development where the Commission has been more and more politicized, in the sense that it all started with Barroso, basically, where he realized, and in order to comfort the national states, in order to give the Commission a more leading role involved in the big political decisions, he had to, be smooth when dealing with member states. And one thing you don't have to do with member states is to start infringement procedures. So they stopped, basically. And this has been ongoing because, especially von der Leyen is, of course, and that's obvious, and for good reasons, she's very, very, almost obsessed with the idea of being the president of Europe. And by doing that, of course, politicizing every question she can. That takes a lot of smoothing also when dealing with the member states. And, living up to the traditional tasks of being the guardian of the treaties, that is somewhat hard for the Commission today when they at the same time want to politicize everything. So this is the background. But coming back to your question, I think that it's mostly needed for them to actually be much more hard on this, in the sense that we really, really have a problem with member states and governments not living up to the standards. Some would say it's the biggest problem at all. We have 27 different regimes, and no one seems to prepare to follow up. And that's why I started the discussion of, can't we have a commissioner committed to this, to implementation and to enforcement? And we were actually able to convince von der Leyen about this. So now we have a commissioner for that, Mr. Dombrovskis. Well, then you can discuss how successful he is. And we will come back to that. It's actually a discussion we are on the bench to have right now, because of course we will follow up on that. What does he actually do, this guy? And we'll see, and I understand that he's lacking tools. He doesn't have a toolbox, because the toolbox would imply that he actually had something, sanctions or fines or whatever, if not talking about infringement. Because the infringement, of course, has the problem that it's a very burdenful and very long procedure. You have maybe 3 or 4 years, but it's coming back to the member states, you have hearings, blah, blah, blah. This is not speedy enough. Right. So we need to have more tools in the toolbox, and we don't have that at the moment. So this is part of the very important discussion we have. Also, if this commissioner have to stay and actually have something to do, we need to provide him with some of the tools.
I hope you will succeed indeed. Last policy area that I would like to touch upon is technology. Because if you look at the difference between the United States and the European Union, the difference in GDP per capita and the pace of productivity growth, it really comes down to one area, which is technology and innovation. If you look at the US, you have all the tech giants. If you look at the European Union, you have all the tech regulation from GDPR to DMA to DSA, the AI Act, possibly now the Digital Fairness Act. There's a lot that we have done on tech in terms of regulation, but not in terms of innovation. So how do we fix this?
Well, regulating is obviously not the way to begin with. But I would mention first that technology is always by definition the leader. If you try to regulate something that doesn't exist, you don't know what it is, you don't know how it works. So it's obviously impossible that you would write legislation that is going to encompass the way it would work and try to streamline it in a certain direction that you feel that it's safe or not. So attempting to regulate our way out of our problems in tech is obviously not correct. First of all, we have to find a way to raise money. This is the obvious thing. We talked a lot about the introduction of a singular capital market, and this has better happened yesterday, but for the barriers that we already discussed. Aside from that, I would say that just removing any available regulation would be the best way to do it. Unfortunately, we're approaching it from the other way around. Of course, when you write legislation like the ones that we have already done, you traditionally favor the big ones for compliance reasons. We mentioned they have giant legal units, they can do compliance, they can take whatever it takes from the Commission, from the Union, and just implement the new rules and follow it. This, of course, does not apply, however, to new players and new entrants. So we have to clear the path for startups, for innovators to do their thing without actually having to comply with the entire gigantic regulatory burden that is currently holding them down. We have to find a way to invest more, because like pure innovation in science and technology, pure investment in science and technology probably, is several times higher both in the US and in China, even with the attempts of the Commission to have programs like Horizon and things like that, invest directly in science. When it comes to AI, which is probably the hottest field right now, I would say that nobody actually knows what it is, and still we're trying to make an act which would define it and somehow streamline it. Here again, we have giant new companies. They have all the resources, they have the best models, they have all the data, and the more we impose regulations on the sector, the more it will be difficult for new entrants to actually acquire data, to use it in a way that it's correct without actually writing any documentation, things like that. So to sum up, we have to clear the path for innovators. We have to find a way to invest more and remove all the regulations which are not extremely necessary for the safety and the survival of the sector.
There's an ongoing digital omnibus in this house, which is good news. And the bad news is that based on Epicenter's regulatory observatory, our experts have given it a score of 6.5 out of 10 when it comes to liberalization, because it tidies up some of the rules, so there is some good parts of it, but it really still keeps the regulatory weight on all the digital companies. So is there something that we can do a little bit more on the digital omnibus?
I think this is the heart of the discussion. I think the digital legislation is sort of showcasing that the dilemma that we are looking at, because no one expects that we don't have a legislation on digital. Even the companies, the businesses themselves, want legislation, because this is the Wild West and has been for some time. Just look at the US. But at the same time, if we count out the big seven in the US, we actually have the same growth rate in Europe and the US. So they are all, this is really the big difference between the US and Europe at the moment, talking about growth, is tech. So we urgently need to do something. Otherwise, investments, as they already are, disappearing. So what to do? We are looking at AI. AI is, of course, the big animal here, and we brag that we had the first global piece of legislation on this. It's already obsolete, and that's basically why we have the omnibus coming up now. But I think, if you ask me personally, I think digital is the example that we need to show that we can do something radically different. Coming back to the 28th regime, I think that this is the answer to this, because as you rightly mentioned, we have so much legislation already, and there will come more. There will be more because of the technology that we are looking at. So, if we want to invest and have innovation on AI-based innovation in Europe, we need to set it free. We simply need to set it free, period. And how to do that, without, inventing the Wild West once more. We have to do it by the 28th regime. We have to pile up all these legislations and find, exemptions, of course. We need to have a threshold. We need to have sandboxes for the small companies to growth and to innovate without being afraid of all this legislation that basically ruins the innovation as such. So the easy answer, there is no easy answer, but the easy answer to this is let's create this 28th regime and let's start by doing it in the digital area.
Plenty to do indeed. And we have talked about so many different policy areas, from technology to energy to occupational licensing. But to me, one thing is clear: we do have to be faster and we do have to be more ambitious about the simplification agenda. And I know that you gentlemen won't be the barrier to this, so thank you so much for all your insights. I really enjoyed this conversation. And if you have enjoyed it too, don't forget to click subscribe and follow Epicenter on all our social media channels. Thank you for tuning in and have a nice day.